Thank you for being here. My name is Beitula. I appreciate you being here. Please keep in mind what we are doing here on Bet On It, Shooting from the Hip. We explore human ideas, philosophies, noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud, a thought exercise, jumping into ideas and examining them and re-examining them. You will find that we are prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. In keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We are not experts of any kind. We are just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information in the hopes that you will find it fun and interesting and entertaining. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now, on with the shit show. Slim, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Today's topic of conversation it's a bit unusual and a little far afield, but is very reoccurring, or has been very reoccurring since about the 1500s, all right? And what I'm referring to is hollow earth. Okay, that was super nerdy. At any rate, the very idea that the earth could be hollow. Now, there are some who've expressed the idea that it's a completely bored out sphere, right? And others who suggested that it's spheres layered within other spheres. We're gonna look at it in the most broadest way. So you'll forgive us, but we're gonna like forego a lot of detailed information with regards to when the first time the very idea was expressed in a public way and became part of the public awareness. And it's an idea that's had popularity throughout, say, like the last 500 years, right? So it's waned in its popularity, and then the idea has just kind of fallen to the wayside, and then something like science fiction will pick the idea up and run with it, and so it's managed to work its way into the lexicon of the conspiracy theorists. So there's a huge range in the idea. Now, why is this worthy of the sort of things that we talk about, which is typically being human? Surprisingly, the hollow earth theory has been attributed to origin stories of humans, that we came from the interior of the earth. So the Hopi Indians have this tradition, I believe the Aztecs too. And this idea is not just a common or just a recent occurrence. It's actually the idea that there's an underground or a livable, habitable space in the underground, or that there's origins for humanity in the underground. In virtually every ancient culture, they have some form of story with regards to that. So, but before we get into all that stuff, I just thought it might be interesting to just go through the details of like the thickness of the planet and the thickness of the crust, and what that might suggest in terms of like the idea of it being hollow, right? Because the conventional and the scientifically held view is that it's a solid object. There's a crust, the mantle, and then I believe the magma and the core or whatever. So it's dense all the way through. Now, the methodologies that they've used to determine that is were through seismic waves and the study of the earth through its magnetic fields, to try and, because their contention is that you'd need an iron core to have the kind of magnetic field that the planet manifests, right? And again, but they can't confirm that definitively, right? Although it's a common held belief, right? So when you think about the Earth's crust, which is the outside layer that we live on, right? So everything that we do on the surface of the planet. And this This crust, its thickness on average is between 15 and 20 kilometers. That's 9 to 12 miles deep before you get to the next layer, right? And at its thinnest, it's about 5 kilometers deep, and that would be like in the ocean, on the ocean crust, right? Um, and at its thickest, probably about 50 kilometers, on average, about 50 kilometers deep, and that's like the continental crust. So that would be like, you know, from the top of a mountain, say, to the bottom of the crust. Now, having said all of that, the center of the Earth itself is 6,400 kilometers or 4,000 miles beneath our feet. And the deepest that it has ever been possible to drill is called the site at which they did this is the Kola Superdeep Borehole at a depth of 12,262 meters or 40,230 feet. It's about 7.61 miles. Right, and it was that was initiated in 1989 in the northwest Russia, and it's the world's deepest human-made hole, and remains so as of 2024. Right, and the reason why they stopped at the depth that they did was because the drilling tools couldn't sustain the heat. Right, so it would melt the drill tip. Right, so it would render it useless. So that was as deep as they were able to go, and all they discovered were incredible temperatures. But that's 7 miles down, right? So, anything is this stirring any kind of thoughts or questions you might have?
No, I'm familiar with the drill hole you mentioned. There's a lot of like theories around what they found down there, why they closed it, but it seems like it's generally recognized that it was just temperature.
Yeah, the equipment wasn't sufficient enough to be able to manage that kind of depth.
Yeah,
Right?
it's an engineering issue because you can also think about all the slag and stuff they would hit in the depth of the crust.
Could you imagine like how much they're penetrating through? It's not just solid rock, right? It's like you say, it's probably slurry of water and which is it's referred to as mineral hydration. So within crusts and stuff, you get water storage, right? So can you imagine like all the crap that they had to penetrate through just to get to the depth that they did get to?
Yeah, I imagine they'd have to like take the drill bit out and clean it off to make sure there's nothing like adhering to the actual bit itself. So it seems like a stressful project in its own.
Oh, and probably very slow going, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, how long were they doing that for?
I
A
don't,
decade?
you know what? You'll forgive me. I didn't get the information, but I vaguely recall it being like about a decade, right? Like maybe 12 years, I think it was, before they decided to scrap it. Because initially it was probably a prestige thing, like this idea that, you know, here we're going to drill this deep into the ocean, or sorry, into the crust of the earth to see what we could find. And they and they never explained why they chose specifically the place that they did to actually do it, whether it was significant or not. And I didn't get that information, so you'll forgive me. Poor research work on my part. So the hollow Earth is a concept proposing that the planet Earth is entirely hollow or contains substantial interior spaces. Now, I don't think that it's entirely hollow, but I'm fascinated by the idea that it does contain these substantial interior spaces. So when you think about the crust, let's just say that the crust itself is porous like a sponge, so it would have these huge open spaces. So you could have a space that would be like in height 2 miles, right? And it could be as long as say 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 miles. So that's an enormous space, right? That suddenly could be available to living organisms, but it would be a biology that's suited for that kind of environment. So they wouldn't be remember, initially, like 50 years ago, they never thought that you'd be able to find anything living at the bottom of the ocean. And now we know that those geothermal vents, that they're incredibly toxic, and it's just the molten core, the superheated pockets of gas being ejected out into the ocean floor, and then so creates two things. It creates warmth, and it creates a habitable environment for sea creatures. So there's crustaceans and organisms like that living around these vents, and then you have all these fish that are deep water fish that are bioluminescent or have some form of it. So how they would manage to get around in that pitch darkness, I can only imagine. But with bats, use sonar and an organic form of sonar to be able to navigate spaces. So I could envision a space like that where it might be full of plant life that's bioluminescent. That's where maybe all the light in that interior space comes from. So it would be dim light. It would be like dusk all the time, stuff. But again, if you listen to some of the more wilder stories, they'll claim that there's an interior sun, or there's something, some kind of plasma providing light to light that space. So all of this is wild, super speculation, but again, super interesting, right?
Some of those things, they're not speculation anymore, like the thermal vent things.
We know that to be true, right?
Yeah, it's not just, the assumption was that you need light in order to provide growth for organic cells, but it's not true. Like, you simply need heat, you need energy to be produced. Like, there's all these weird creatures with like thick carbon shells. It's because of all the off-gassing from the vent. Right,
because it's a super toxic environment, but there's organisms that adapt to that toxicity and doesn't prevent them from carrying out life functions, right?
Yeah, for them it's like, it's
their environment,
right? 700 degweird Celsius. It's a bit nippy out.
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah, it's strange how easily, or not how easily, that's a really weird way to put it. But it's interesting to see how they evolved to like be in these spaces.
Well, it really does speak to the adaptability of living organisms. So then, because we're so adaptable, and I think as humans we have a high expression of adaptability. And if you doubt me, think of people who live in the Arctic and Antarctic, like indigenous people who, without technology, managed to thrive in what would seem as completely inhospitable environments, and yet they manage to function and have a rich culture and traditions, even though they're living in basically a frozen desert.
Right? Yeah, I agree.
Right, so then we're entertaining the idea that it's not unreasonable for this to be an occurrence, but that's not it's not definitive. It's not proof that goes on. But then when you look at places like Derinkuyu in Turkey, are you familiar with this place I'm talking about?
It sounds familiar. I know
I can't remember how deep it goes, but it's basically an underground city hewn out of rock.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they had ventilation shafts. So the kind of preparation that you would require in advance before you actually started digging, like to know exactly how you're going to dig, it's mind-blowing, right? So, and it's an example of people, and if I'm not mistaken, the number of people that were estimated to inhabit that place would have been about 20,000 people.
I've seen photos online. Apparently, you can actually get a hotel room in some of those places.
Oh, is that right?
Which I thought was kind of ridiculous, but also at the same time, it's like...
kind of cool.
Yeah.
Kind of weird cool.
Yeah, it's like, what are you going to do? Take rocks home?
But still, just be interesting to you know, to experience, or at least for prestige, you can make the claim that, like, you know, I stayed in a hotel underground or an Airbnb that's been around for like thousands of years. Because it's been hewed out of rock. So there was a notable person that actually in the 17th century who actually seriously considered the idea that the Earth was hollow, and that was Edmond Halley, right? And however, the notion was disproven first tentatively in 1740 by a French scientist, and then definitively by Charles Hutton in his experiments that he conducted in 1774. So, he used magnetism to illustrate that it couldn't be hollow, because it would require this, you know, iron core that would be responsible for sustaining the magnetic field of the planet. So, and again, the specifics of the experiment that he conducted to determine that definitively, I think it was with a plumb line on the top of a mountain, and then looking for deviations, and then that would be suggestive of like how substantial this iron core might be. So remember, that's the conventional view.
With the plumb line,
with a magnet at the bottom of the plumb line, so it would interact with the magnetic field.
So this guy must have had some really complicated math to work with.
Yeah, I'm gonna. This is not my area of specialty, and I don't presume to know exactly the specifics of the details of the experiment. I could have dug all that information up. It was available, but I don't know that it would have been entertaining enough for people. Suffice it to say, if you're really interested in it, you can just look it up yourself. Again, we always suggest that no matter what we're talking about, you shouldn't take us at face value. We're just having this conversation in the hopes that maybe it'll be stimulating, and maybe it'll cause in you, or whoever the listener is, it'll cause for them to have cause to pause and think, sorry, tongue-tied, to consider this by themselves. And again, you can dismiss it outright. I mean, there's no definitive proof, like completely that's unquestionable, of whether, you know, the claims that it's solid with a solid iron core, or whether or not it's, you know, hollow as stuff. Like I said, myself personally, I don't know that I necessarily buy into the idea that it's hollow, but that the crust could be perforated full of holes, and we're going to illustrate that. And I'll illustrate that further when we get into my note package, very specifically. That here there are examples of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, to go into the specifics of how this one individual used a plumb line, that's overkill for our conversation, like typically.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you think about like the great lengths people went to like understand.
Yeah, and this was 300 years ago, right? So again, in part it speaks to how clever we are as human beings. We are highly intelligent, you know. So, and there's great examples of people that exercise that intelligence. Now he, for all intents and purposes, he was considered correct, but he, you know, there's a margin for error that he might have been wrong too.
Yeah, like we know there's underground wells, like
aquifers, like rivers that run underground.
Yeah, right? So there's a fair amount of like, well, it's not solid, but it's something.
Again, I think that, I can't remember who said it, but reality is not only stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. That's why I don't like to take ideas like this and just dismiss them outright. I go, what if there's a kernel of truth to the idea? What if what if it's suggestive of something? And we'll get more into that. So the concept of hollow earth still reoccurs in folklore as a premise for things like subterranean fiction or the subgenre of adventure fiction, which 100 years ago and in the very late 1800s, there was a lot of fiction that popularized the idea that there's a hollow interior to the earth, and people ate that stuff up, right? So again, it's, you know, it's very closely related to science fiction. So and that's probably what sustained it. But there's other things that are more evidence-based where you go that are suggestive. Again, it's not definitive proof. All of this is wild speculation. It's what we do really good here, right? So, and then even within the modern lexicon of conspiracy theories, there's a hypothesis of cryptoterrestrials, or the idea of ultra-terrestrials, so that you have a developing society. Sometimes I think some think they're like lizard people. Others who say they're just simply like us, right? And they have substantial societies within the earth and stuff like that. And again, there's no evidence one way or another, and because of the amount of science fiction that's been out there that's used those very themes, we'd be hard pressed to say absolutely one way or the other, or absolutely that could be a possibility. Might, but then it becomes about likelihood, like, you know, like,
yeah, like we mentioned how there's the well, you said aquifers, I said wells for whatever reason.
yeah.
There's also thermal vents. There's all these different transfers of energy.
You know what a cenote is?
No.
Okay, so they're giants. They're not necessarily always giant, but they're large sinkholes that occur in Central America, Mexico and Central America, and where they're full of water. And actually, part of some of the resort traveling that you can go and do, you can swim in the cenotes. They have, like, you know, wooden stairs that lead down into, so it's an enormous opening in the ground that goes down like 30, 40, 50 feet, and it's partially filled with water. And the indigenous people used to would go to the cenotes and perform rituals, because they've discovered, like, artifacts and human remains, like skeletons, within the cenotes and stuff. So they interpret that to mean that they were probably, you know, trying to communicate with their gods for whatever their requirement was, and these locations, they would use them. You never heard of a cenote before, right?
I'm familiar with the concept. I've never heard of it within their culture.
Yeah, there's lots of indigenous cultures where the cenotes are a natural occurring feature within the landscape. They would use them as ritual sites. And like I said, a lot of them. There have been exploration using divers, using really sensitive equipment, and going down and seeing all these artifacts, like jars and everything you can possibly imagine from a culture that might think it might be worthy of, like, using as an offering for their gods. And they would they'd drop it into the cenote, right? And like I said, all the cenotes are tied in to the aquifers of groundwater, but they seep in, so it's not the water's typically very still. And what makes them super interesting is it actually makes them really creepy looking. The trees above, from the landscape above, their roots penetrate down into the cenote to draw water from the cenote itself. So it adds this huge creepy element when they're diving in there. I've watched a few, you know, God bless the internet. Where you know, they've highlighted that, and they've shown it, like live footage from divers and researchers exploring the cenotes. And in fact, I know somebody who went to Mesoamerica, like she's on a vacation, and he's a certified diver, and he got to dive in a cenote, right? And he said it was a surreal kind of experience because he's dived in like lakes and oceans, and this was like just a departure from that. Very, very similar, but very different in its own right. So can you imagine, right? So what an interesting experience to have. So any of you would-be adventurers out there, you can maybe explore the underworld, right, as it were. So in the late 19th century, I'm going to get it away from the cenotes and these underground features, and we're going to move on to mysticism. So Theosophy in the late 19th century, the Theosophical Society was co-founded by Helena Blavatsky, alluded to the Shambhala myth. Blavatsky, who claimed to be in contact with the Great White Lodge of the Himalayan Adepts. So the Great White Lodge is not a reference to skin color. It's like, I think, like white magic versus black magic. I think it's that sort of thing. It's that type of mysticism. And she made the claim that she was, channeling them, or in some way in psionic telepathic contact with this Great White Lodge of Himalayan Adepts. She mentions Shambhala in several places, but without giving it any specifically great emphasis. So it was more something that she mentioned in passing. So you can see examples now that 100 years ago was any kind of urban center that would draw a mystic like this who's trying to, create networks, and that they might reference it to, and can imagine people 100 years ago who, weren't aware of like the fact that there was even a place called Tibet, let alone a hidden city, Shambhala, and all this sort of thing, and that these great mystics, ascended beings or whatever they might be, ascended masters, all this stuff. It's all part of that entire mystic subculture that came up in the late 1800s, and it was, fiction contributed to it, and then hearsay and anecdotal accounts, people claiming that they'd experienced it. And it's pervasive. It's moved right up until the present day. And so, you can look at, there's tons of examples of where locations around the planet are cited as access or entry points into this hollow earth, all over the place. Like, people like Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who in 1946 took an entire flotilla from the U.S. down to Antarctica because the Nazis had a vested interest in this idea of a hollow earth, and they sent contingents to Antarctica. And again, it's a pretty sordid story, and there's a lot of it's hearsay that you can't confirm or deny, but it's there. So then either it's complete fabrication, just utter bullshit, or there might be some kind of truth to it all, that there could very well be, like, endless caverns within the crust, say within that maximum 50 kilometers of crust, that it's perforated full of caverns and that sort of thing. So, is
the common belief at that time that Shambhala was within Earth, or was it like an ethereal plane?
Well, here. So some claimants say that it's a physically real place that you go to. It's a city. Others suggest, and they're usually like the mystic types, they suggest that it's like it's this mental kind of thing that you acquire, a place that you some kind of like achieved mental state, right? That it's not exactly a physical place, but um, I'm going to save it because there's some more interesting stuff that I want to comment, and that in terms of modern belief and systems of faith that will tell you that it's as real as their religion is, that it's a real place, and they identify the actual locations, which I'm going to get to, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So and because it's been this idea that's nested in the human psyche, expeditions and location and people have launched expeditions to find the location, and one of the more notable ones was Nicholas and Helena Roerich, and they were essentially like Russians who emigrated to the U.S. and then under the auspices of the American government, they were like, we want you to find out if there's any truth to any of this. So they led an expedition in 1924 to 1928 to find Shambhala. They believed that the Beluga Mountains at Altai Mountains the Beluga Mountain in the Altai Mountains was an entrance, and they chose that location because it was a common belief in that region. This is like in Tibet, right? There's a French Buddhist named Alexander David Neal. He associated Shambhala with the Balkh in present-day Afghanistan, also offering the Persian Sham-i-Bala, which means elevated candle, as the origin of the name. So that maybe, it was also tied to Shambhala in Afghanistan. Hitler sent several expeditions to Tibet in the 30s to contact Agartha. Agartha is another name for this underground city, which is not the same as Shambhala, right? So there are enormous traditions, and virtually every indigenous group on the planet has traditions of like vast underground places that are real physical places that you can travel to, right? Like I said, the Hopi Indians and the American Southwest, they said the ant people, after a great devastation, the ant people brought humans to the surface from the underground.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with the story of that.
Yeah, so like I said, so there's precedence here. So now, whether or not it's just folklore, it could very well be. But there's a part of me that wonders that could it be tied to kind of like a forgotten memory. It's a vague recollection of something that they kind of remember but kind of don't remember, right? So, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I would love to think about this from a point of view of like theology, human experience, like how this could have been passed on as a tradition. But the idea that there's like a holy place with monks, and they found like the way. Sounds beautiful.
It gets way more interesting. Like, so when, and at least within some of the traditions, it becomes, because all of them are very involved, and most of them are very detailed in terms of like how they talk about these places, right? Now, there's so many different versions of this idea of Shambhala or Agartha. Some suggest that Shambhala was the inspiration for Shangri-La, a paradise on earth hidden in a Tibetan valley, which features in a 1933 novel called Lost Horizon by British author James Hilton. Right, so it's there within cultural folklore traditions, and then it's also popularized and the idea is kept alive through fiction. So like I said, is this some kind of vague memory that we keep promoting forward through time, that's a recollection of something that a memory that we've actually forgotten. So it's just it's the memory in really broad strokes. It's watered down. You're not getting the actual memory. It's a version of that memory.
Yeah, it's at least 2 layers removed, like an abstract version of the shadow of the original thing.
Right. So again, having said that, that means that even based on what details they do provide in terms of the folklore and stuff, that it's vague, like that it doesn't, we can't be certain that of what the origin of it is, other than maybe that this, the fact of the idea that there could be substantial ultra-terrestrials or crypto-terrestrials living within the crust of the planet.
Yeah, my bias really wants it really wants like this idea to be true. Like you could one day find a cave explorer that found like an underground temple with monks and all these like just brilliant writings. I don't know how they decipher it, but brilliant writings. And then the message or the theology behind that factual place was distorted, but it still has that same original message in a more contemporary way. I feel like that's a very strong indication the culture was so potent that it lasted this whole time.
Right, and so again, super cool. And the heavy duty sci-fi nerd in me loves this as a trope in science fiction. That the idea that like there are hollow Earths or a variation on the idea of a hollow Earth, right? So, and again, like I said, I don't personally, I don't really have a dog in the fight, but I find it more likely that if this was a real thing, that it might be based on the idea that you have these extensive cave or caverns within the crust of the earth, and that potentially maybe, it might be the story of like how people avoided devastation by traveling into the crust of the planet to wait out the devastation and then return to reclaim the earth. Maybe that's the foundation of it all. Again, just wild speculation on my part, right? So, but it's not unreasonable.
Yeah, it seems at least arguable that there would be a chance for microbiology and even small creatures within the earth, but like a whole civilization, it's like that's a different argument.
Right, and again, when I get to some more like grounded empirical evidence, it'll lend credibility to the idea, but it's not proof, right? It just suddenly suggested maybe something like that could happen.
Right from the get-go, I like watching what's it called? Cave divers. So these people that go
spelunkers.
Yeah, no, their content is amazing, and they'll find like these absolutely massive areas. I wouldn't be surprised if there's enough physical space for these things.
To me, it seems very likely that there is, because like you, I've watched a number of documentaries like where they're cave divers and spelunkers and even like the cave systems. I can't remember where it is in Kentucky. There's stories of Mount Shasta. Sorry, let me try that again. Shasta in California, where it's supposed to have. It's a single lone mountain standing out of a little landscape. It apparently has caves that lead you to the city of Telos, deep within the mountain, right? Like, so again, it's these super interesting ideas, and if you take the time even to do just a brief search, you'll be surprised by how much it's a part of our culture, present day culture, never mind older cultures that have brought it forward through time to the present. So getting on to this idea of like Shambhala or Shangri-La or Gartha, that these are communities, they're urban centers within the planet. Agartha is a legendary kingdom that is said to be located in the inner surface of the earth, and is sometimes it's related to hollow earth theory, but you can see where all this stuff kind of overlaps. It's hard to separate the stuff beyond the cultural differences, but the ideas themselves that that they feed into each other, right? And is a popular subject in esoterica. So the esoteric, like the modern day mystics, people who are in the New Age and that sort of thing, are more prone to these ideas. It's not, and again, it's not necessarily that these ideas are that far afield, right, or that unusual, right? It's just there's no evidence definitively for it, but then again, there's no evidence definitively against it either, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking of suggestive evidence. Like, one of the things I always found strange is there's like ancient writings on people who believed in like this idea of cosmic waves and everything's made of these frequencies, and I find it interesting they would think that, and nowadays we have an understanding of material science down to like atomic levels, subatomic levels, and then people are theorizing with math, oh, everything's made of string, that's string theory.
Right.
It seems kind of wild. If that's true, like, was it the most culturally convenient way to explain things for those people thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago? Or
Maybe.
like, it's just so peculiar.
It's enormously peculiar. Even when you consider, like, there's other thinking too that says that. Have you ever heard of songs of spheres? Okay, so also celestial bodies like the planet Earth, they resonate with a frequency, and that frequency actually has a sound quality. Which, and any of you who are listening to this, go on YouTube and in the search window enter "Songs of Spheres," and you want to listen to the Earth song. Then there's others who make the speculation that what you can do is, if you want to travel to another celestial body, that all you need to know is what the resonating frequency of that, or the song of that sphere specifically, and you could instantaneously travel to that location. So what if this idea of them penetrating into caves, into the earth, doesn't lead them to the center of the earth, it leads them to another celestial sphere? Again, just a crazy speculation on my part. So that if everything's made of strings, everything's connected, and you have spooky action at particle entanglement, spooky action at distance, why do you need spaceships then to travel from celestial sphere to celestial sphere? If you knew what the resonating frequency of it was, that maybe you could travel there instantaneously. I don't know. I'm just off the top of my head, right? Like, just wild bullshit.
All these old theologies at least lend to like very interesting concepts to speculate on for like sci-fi. So like, even if you want to just think about the narratives it could mean, it's a great way to just spend an afternoon going like, oh, if I were to write a book about the subject in the sci-fi realm, like, how would it flesh out? And you might find some consistencies.
Well, again, like I said, I think because these are themes that we've seen reoccur in science fiction, and they're interesting. It makes for great entertainment. Even this very conversation, the idea of all of this is entertaining, but it's, again, really scarce on any kind of evidence one way or the other. But there's, like I said, there's a lot of circumstantial and anecdotal evidence that which is a form of evidence, but I don't know how much credibility you can assign to it. The legend of Agartha remained mostly obscure in Europe until a gentleman named Gerard and Costas edited and republished a detailed 1886 account by the 19th century French occultist Alexandre Saint-Yves de la Vedra from 1842 to 1909. so that kind of repopularized the idea of this underground, uh, or rather, like, yeah, these ultra-terrestrials or the cryptoterrestrials. The idea of them are, humans living underground, and it was an idea that once repopularized by 1910, after World War I, German occultist groups such as the Thule Society took an interest in Agartha, right? And then started expanding on the idea of Agartha under their biases. So their subjectivity, they embraced the idea of Agartha, and then used it as part of their ideology, right? So they integrated it into their ideology.
Yeah, that seems consistent to a lot of things that happen culturally. Like we incorporate the previous generation always.
Right. So again, it's allowed for the idea of Agartha to propagate forward, or the much broader idea that that there are livable spaces within the earth, and that humans are in those spaces, or people like humans living in those spaces. So there's a Polish explorer, Ferdynand Ossendowski, and he relates a story in which was imparted to him concerning a subterranean kingdom is existing inside the earth, in the 1922 book Beasts, Men, and Gods. Right? So again, the idea keeps finding life within individuals, and some who lay claims or share somebody else's anecdotal account, a story they heard from someone else, right? So you go, like, all of this is all fascinating, and there's so many more examples of it, which we're not going to go into here. Right? Like, honestly, you could spend hours just citing the examples of what we're talking about. But what I would like to do is now we're going to look at, like, real world examples of what we're talking about, right? So have you ever heard of the Son Dong Cave in Vietnam?
Oh, you told me about that.
Yeah.
I think it was a while ago you did.
Yeah, okay, so it's in Phong Nha Ke Bang National Park in Bo Trak District and the Quang Binh Province. It's one of the world's largest natural caves. And it's been translated for Vietnamese as the Cave of the Mountain River, or the Cave of the Mountains behind Dong Village, because there's a village that's closely located to this enormous cave, right? And so it was named for the system was named for the village, and it was found in 1991 by a local man, Ho Khan. And it's a solutional cave. A solutional cave, or solution caves, or karst cave, is a cave usually formed in like limestone or supple stone, right? So that's stuff that if you introduce water, it erodes it and dissolves it away, and leaving whatever space that it was in. It dissolves all the minerals and then leaves an enormous opening. Right?
So would these be like porous rocks?
Yeah, so that's why they cite limestone as one of these soluble rocks, right? So, and the speculation from the researchers is that it was formed between 2 to 5 million years ago, right? And expeditions conducted surveys back in April of 2009 of the cave and its volume, which is 38,500,000 metric cubed. That's how enormous the space is, right? Like, so that's basically 1.36 times 109 cubic feet. So it's enormous. So anyway, the progress exploring the cave's full length was stopped by large obstacles even within the cave. Like, so the cave system kept going on, but they had difficulty traversing some of these obstacles with 60-meter high stone or high flowstone coated wall, which the expedition named the Great Wall of Vietnam. The estimated length of the cave system exceeds 9 kilometers. Right? And they're certain of the 9 kilometers because that's as far as they could go. Right? So it's so massive, it contains its own jungle, underground river, and localized weather system. In fact, the reason why they discovered it, there was a huge opening in the side of a, I don't want to call it a mountain, but a side of an enormous hill that clouds from the ecosystem inside the cave would spew out this exit. Right?
That's really cool.
Yeah, so this subterranean wetland includes all underground areas containing water, including caves and aquifers. And you have these independent ecosystems that are separate from the ecosystem that exists outside of the cave.
If I'm right, which cave you're talking about, is this the one where you can find a photo of a bunch of tents and it looks like they're
yeah, those were the researchers who were trying to determine size and length of this cave.
Yeah, but the depth of the hill, or from the hill to where they're camping, was like stories.
Yeah.
It's an incredible photo.
Yes,
it's really incredible.
So again, it's a real world example of what we're talking about, and it demonstrates really clearly that nature or natural systems like ecosystems can develop virtually anywhere. So to me, it's suggestive then that even within an ecosystem that was, let's say, inside an enormous cavern that only has heat from it's warm because of the geothermal heat, and if it has water, then maybe it could produce. Then maybe it would have a complete ecosystem. And again, much like the ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean, they would be living organisms. Bioluminescence would very likely be a part of that because it'd be, there wouldn't be a light source, at least not one that to our knowledge would be available to them. So again, it could be, you can imagine some form of like moss that cover the entire interior of a cavern that's like 2 miles high and goes on for tens of miles in either direction, and this plant matter would just irradiate light, like it'd be low light, but it'd still be light, and the entire cavern, you would look up and the entire interior of the cavern would be lit by this bioluminescence. Dimly lit, but it would be a light of a kind, right? Like, and if it's warm and there's water, then there very likely could be living organisms. Now, to what level of complexity and whether or not you would have something as complex as us inhabiting a region like that and then building vast cities, I don't know. But it's a super interesting idea.
It's definitely it's definitely possible if you have an entire ecosystem, you give it enough time, you could get like fairly simple life forms, but at the same time, there's so many interesting things you get even with like fairly simple life forms. Like moss is a lot cooler than people think. And even if you get to like plants where they require pollination, that means there's methods to actually find these caves if they require pollination from outside the cave.
Well,
you just follow the bees.
Okay, there could be that, or we could have organisms that we're currently unaware of. So like insects that would do what the bees do. They're pollinators, and so in that space, it wouldn't be bees necessarily itself. It would be this other insect that fills that role. Right? Yeah,
like a niche ecosystem. I'm just so curious about how the ecosystem would work within a cave like that.
Well, again, I think it's something that certainly is interesting and stirs the imagination. That you go, what's the next step beyond that? Like, complex ecosystems don't just arise. They take an enormous amount of time to establish within any given environment, and then to entrench themselves into that environment. So then now they are inseparable from the environment.
Wow, this reminds me so much of Piranha 3D, where yeah, there's like a bunch of piranhas that are locked away in a cave that got closed off millions and millions of years ago. They break out and they're like apex predator times 10. Like it'd be cool.
A fish with enormous dentures.
I mean, it would be really cool to see these things, but I'd be so terrified. Like, oh, there's like a rodent, but it has like detachable jaws. It can leap up in the air.
What's it? The xenomorph from the Alien movies, except a mammal.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So again, we just cited another example where the use of the idea of like interior spaces or caves that suddenly introduce something into the environment that like that becomes a potential threat. So it makes you wonder about the hazards of maybe exploring caves, right? Again, I think there's another great, example of cave networks under the Giza pyramid and aquifers there, in Sacsayhuaman in Peru. If I'm wrong about that, please forgive me. There's extensive underground systems, because part of the indigenous peoples the idea was this underworld of Shambhala, and there were vast networks of caverns underneath these ancient sites. So it's always been a part of human societies. The question becomes then, like, is it everything that's grown up around the idea that maybe the hidden cities and that sort of thing, is that real? And again, we couldn't say. No one could say unless you've been there. And if you have, please reach out and let us know. Right? Photographs only. Right? Never mind. So I'm going to get into an interesting real world connection with Shambhala, right? And this idea of a pristine city, right? Mount Kailash, which is a mountain in the Nagari prefecture, and it's Tibet, the anonymous region of China. It lies in the Kailash range of the trans-Himalayan western part of the Tibetan plateau. And Mount Kailash is elevation is about 6,638 meters in height, so it's about 21,778 feet tall, and you can't climb to the top of it. It's just one of those ones, like, there's just no physical way to do it, right? And it's got a real it almost looks like the top of it almost looks pyramidal, almost like a pyramid, right? Like, so it's a very unusual looking feature that stands alone too. That's the other thing. So it's part of the northwestern trijunction of the borders between China, India, and Nepal. According to Buddhist texts, Mount Kailash, or Kailasa, is known as the mythical mountain Meru, right? And Shambhala, and in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Shambhala is a spiritual kingdom. Shambhala is mentioned in the Kalachakra Tantra. So it's deeply rooted in the indigenous people and local culture. And the mythological relevance of the place originates with prophecies according to which Shambhala will be the birthplace of the Kaliki, the next incarnation of Vishnu, who will usher in a new age, a Satyuga. So it's tied deeply into this idea that, like, the return of their divinity, and it's because the divinity is there in that place, right? And again, there's all slight variations, but for the Buddhists, the prophesied ruling kingdom of the Maitreya, the future Buddha, The Shambhala is a mystical Buddhist kingdom said to exist somewhere between the Himalayan mountains and the Gobi Desert. Right? In Shambhala, all of the citizens have achieved enlightenment, and so it is the embodiment of Tibetan Buddhist perfection. Scholars believe it is simply symbolic or allegorical. So those who are Western experts in the field treat it like it's just a great story, which it may well be. But then again, what if there's truth to it? What if what their tradition holds is absolutely true, right? And again, I couldn't say definitively that it is. I'm just, again, it's speculation. For a moment, pause and consider the idea that maybe deep within the planet or deep within certain regions, there's all these caverns that lead to a single location, right? And the location is like, this. What if that's the source of all the UFOs? What if that's the source of, the idea that like they're gonna return, and then we're gonna interact not with aliens but humans for all intents and purposes, who would be an alien culture, but that we have some familiarity with based on Tibetan Buddhism, which is where you find it. Predominantly, and but it's not exclusive to them either, right? So what if the idea is that you have these humans who live deep underground come to the surface and go, hey, you guys are doing it all wrong, and some of the shit you've been doing has had negative effects on us, right? And now you need to stop, you need to behave, you have to endless wars on top of endless wars and exploiting each other and horrific violence. You go like, you're stunned, you're stupid, stop it. I go, that's a pretty endearing idea, or to me that's a real cool idea.
It seems consistent with the theology, because the concept where you have, I think the right word is progenitor, like those who came before.
Right.
Yeah, like, so these initial people had a certain I don't know if secular is the right word, but it's not a religious belief. It's a fundamental human belief.
But it might be because it's so interwoven with a religious structure that what if the idea is you have people who just, and the Buddhist ideology is about the middle way, a balanced sort of way of living. What if you had people fleeing like violence from the surface who were ideologically all Buddhists, who find a habitable space within the center of the planet, and then they thrive. And not only do they thrive, but then they create the society that we've always aspired to, one that's balanced, one where they're not exploiting each other, in horrific ways. That, wouldn't that be fascinating?
Yeah, for me, if I don't know, man. I don't want to like speculate too much, but
that's what we do here.
No, fair. No, that's fair. But when it comes to this concept of there's a progenitor culture, and it left behind like these vast amounts of wisdom we have been chipping away at and losing, ultimately forming a very, very different culture.
Okay, so it could go two ways. So you could have these highly evolved ideologies that developed on the surface, and then they fled from the violence of the surface and found inhabitable spaces in the interior and then evolved on their own. Or we could all have been created in the interior in these inhabitable spaces, and then we're the ones who managed to get to the surface.
Well, that's what I'm saying about progenitors. Like, since there's so many connections between these places, like even through the vocabulary, like Shambhala, and the other one was
Agartha,
Shangri-La, like a lot of very similar. What was the one that they used for Egypt? It's not Shambhala or Shangri-La.
No, but with Egypt, it's the caverns underneath the Great Pyramid. And apparently, there's a cave system underneath the Great Pyramid. To what extent, I don't know.
I forgot the name of it, but these interconnected names could at least suggest that there was crossover between cultures that were descendants from these progenitors.
Maybe.
Yeah, it could be that. In my mind, I like to think about things from this concept of like, oh, we're people, we spread out. It's not too unrealistic that we have cross-cultural similarities, but like, it's how much suggestive evidence point towards one thing or another.
Right,
really
but
decides.
and remember, all the evidence that we have is anecdotal and circumstantial. It's none of it's definitive evidence one way or the other. So then you can't say with any kind of absolute certainty that what the root of all this is. All we know is that it's been there since the beginning of our histories.
Yeah. Can I lay out 3 points?
Please.
I'm really bad at keeping points.
It's okay. It's okay.
So we have cross-cultural contamination is not the right word, but it's this idea.
Yeah, the sharing of ideas.
Yeah, but not only the sharing of ideas, but like there's structure behind it. It's reality. Like to them, it's real.
Right.
So we have that. We also have the language that backs it up. We have in Turkey people that quite literally lived in the ground. If you think about these things, it's not too unrealistic to think, oh, maybe there's a theology out there
Right. It's
that got blown out of proportion, but it at least points towards there was a divergence of a culture, like one specific culture that spread throughout the Middle East.
or across the world even. It's not unreasonable, but again, the question becomes: is it true?
Right.
Right, and that we can't answer. We can't answer that. So then the answer is we just don't know, which is fine. Again, but doesn't it make for some great conversation, right?
Yeah, the problem of knowing, like certainty itself, is very difficult to know because, like, you think about this is unrelated but similar circumstance. You think about Cedric Diggory, who was on, I forget what show it was, but he showed the JFK film. And a lot of people haven't seen the unreleased full footage. And that was like this huge moment for people. They're like, oh, wait a minute. This is something we should keep on record. Just to have, the recorded reality available. You can think what you want, but it's there. So when you think about all of these cultures that have similar vocabulary to describe similar locations, like
the similar idea that somehow that we inhabited the interior of the planet long before we inhabited the surface.
Yeah, so I think it's extremely suggestive that there is either a physical real thing like Shangri-La, which I find possible, but like how much of that story we know now is the core of the story. Like,
we can't, and again, we can't say with certainty.
Right. But it was a very strong belief, and that seems almost certain to me.
Excuse me. Sorry, I don't know where a sneeze came right out of nowhere. But so then the idea of a hollow earth, or even places like Agartha, Shambhala, Shangri-La, that it's the longest game of telephone over time.
Yeah.
Right. So every version, or every time we get an iteration of it, it's a distortion of the original. So having said that, then when you go to the original source of what inspired this, we can't say definitively what, but sure is interesting to think about.
Yeah, it's at least possible. This idea of an underground city with advanced, not technology, but advanced understanding of self. That's a very real thing that could have happened. If you look at the underground city in Turkey, you put a bunch of monks in there. They're Shangri-La, or not Shangri-La, the underground city.
Darren Kuyu.
Yeah. Wait, was it?
That's Darren Kuyu. There's more than one, right? Right. So some scholars have suggested that Shambhala is located near Mount Kailash in the Himalayas. and it's become a place of sacred pilgrimage for Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains. The kingdom represents the pinnacle of Tibetan Buddhist ideals, where all inhabitants have attained enlightenment, earning the moniker the Pure Land. So it's also known as the Pure Land, right? Or as, forgive me if I butcher this pronunciation, but it's also been known as Olongring, Shangri-La, Paradise, and even Eden. Because there's some wild speculators out there who've suggested that when God cast Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, it was out of the interior of the planet. They had to cast them out, so they had to live on the surface.
That leads to a lot more speculation.
But like I said, it's an idea now that it's taken on a life of its own, and it's fueled and fed by everyone who speculates on it, and it's allowed for it to survive for hundreds, thousands of years.
I think it's suggestive at least that there's some culture that had a physical place, even if the story got embellished, like hypothetically, there's at least like, yeah, there was a real place, that there were people gathering for this sentiment of peace and, you know, something resembling what Eden would be. Like, for me, that's my baseline. Sorry,
yeah, but no, it's okay. Like, but like, the idea is like fascinating that you'd have these enlightened individuals who congregate, who create a city and create a society that's really self-contained, and that actually might not even be accurate. What would prevent them from expanding further into other inhabitable spaces within, like, because there are some who offer up the idea that all those networks are all that all those sorry, let me restate that all those caves or caverns, no matter how large or how small they are, they're all networked together, right? So I go, that's a trippy idea. So then they could have an enormous population. They could be a significant amount. And they're not just monks. They're artisans or people who are, you know, who would be the equivalent of farmers, like who do agriculture in those spaces. They've got to eat. So it requires, like, so there's all these practical requirements that have to be serviced by these enormous spaces. But if they have complex ecosystems in those spaces, then it's not unreasonable then to think that they would just simply harvest whatever they needed from the local ecosystem, and then Darren Kuyu is a perfect example, and they would just work within the cavern system itself. So their cities might be carved right out of the sides of the caverns themselves. And instead of like the way we think of it, as standalone in the middle of an open space, why would they do that? They could just build into the walls of the cavern or an enormous cave that they're in, right?
It would be pretty creepy seeing like a brick house, like a small one, just in the middle of a cavern.
Yeah, but like I said, I don't imagine that if they were going to, they'd probably just dig right into the stone itself and create livable, habitable things that would pass as dwellings, personal dwellings, right into the face of the rock itself or the face of the cavern, right? So, and again, if there's like springs or water aquifers there that they have access to, then it's not unreasonable then to think that those things might have like complex life forms like fish, right? They harvest the fish. I mean, I'm just you know, speculating in the wildest way, but again, it makes for super interesting, you know, ideas. I mean, I dare say that the idea that we could have a humanity that paralleled us and it developed in a radically different way compared to us, we're really like rooted in materialism and the ideology of like consumption and consumerism and competition, where you could have a culture of humans who would be living proof that you didn't need to live in the way that we currently live. So talk about a threat to the mainstream, a mainstream kind of ideology would threaten to overturn the idea, because people are going, wait a minute, why don't we live like them? They don't have violence in their society. They they don't have issues with people starving because they manage their resources far more effectively and efficiently than we do. But then how is a society like that? What kind of leadership is it? Is it, or does a society, is that led by like a religious leader or an empirical kind of, the emperor, right? And he's like a Buddhist, so this emperor's like he would be an emperor of kindness. And he'd just make decisions that based on the well-being of the entire community versus his own self-interest. So an emperor of kindness, if that's even possible.
I think if there's going to be depending on the size of the population, the most beneficial person to have at the top would literally be whoever's the best at agriculture. It's like, who's best at feeding the people? Okay, you're in the position of power.
Or somebody who's really good at organizing, and their management skills are so great that they're able to take whatever the agriculture can produce and ensure then that there's an even distribution of it. And then if they all participate in the same religious rituals and practices, and then outside of that they have forms of entertainment, which would probably be like more like plays and musicians and orchestras and stuff, not in the way that we envision it, where it's for social media, the separate music industry, separate, and even though that you can put it all under the umbrella of entertainment industries and movies, TV, that sort of stuff that we use to amuse ourselves, right? And then our ideology, our religious ideology, is separate from that and stuff. What if you have this human society where that all of that's integrated, but they don't do it electronically? It's all analog for them. Everything's hands-on. It's all, they can still, be capable of great engineering feats, but they're kind of, without the benefit of electronic technology. Who's to say that they don't demonstrate things or develop as a result of like their religious practices and living isolated from the surface, that they don't develop telepathy and psychokinesis and all that crap? I mean, who's to say, right? And again, it makes for super interesting science fiction, but what if they were the kind of humans that ended up on a radically different developmental path?
Yeah, like currently there's a bunch of different cultures, but when we consider like very Western is this concept that everything on our spare time should be, well, not everybody believes this, but being a consumer, you want to be entertained. If you have limited resources, though, you can't be entertained by video games or movies or many things we enjoy. So instead of being entertained, you entertain thoughts or you entertain skills.
Well, I could amuse myself endlessly by plugging into all the electronics I have available to me, but I don't.
Right.
What I do is I favor sourcing out information, things that force me to think, right, and to consider what it is that I am doing, and then by extension what we as a collective species and a planetary society, which is right now, this is supposed to be the age of Aquarius, the age of like peace, enlightenment, all that stuff, and it almost seems like we're so contented with just fucking each other over, and everybody has an argument to defend their position and defend horrible decisions that they make. And I'm going, just fucking, all you are self-serving when you do that, and when it gets reduced to that. And so to me, it's incredibly tiring that you go, wait, cooler heads can't prevail. We can't fucking figure out a better way to do this shit other than to fucking unleash on ourselves. And the idea of the hollow earth, or these cities within the hollow earth, whether it's, you know, Telos and Mount Shasta, Agartha, Shambhala, they're people, they're populated by people who elevated themselves as human beings to a place where they don't use violence recklessly and as casually as we do, right? And now we're greater and greater examples of it. So I'm like, you know, it's time to grow the fuck up. There's no nice way of saying this. We all, as an entire species, we need to fuck off and grow up, or grow up and fuck off. But in either event, we need to take our collective heads out of our asses, because we're completely reckless, right? And if you doubt me, just watch, you know, the traditional media news outlets.
Yeah, with the complication of just, not with the complication, with the complexity growing in society, fundamental rules are ignored. Like, people want to function more as somebody who can make money because we associate that with value. But then
and success.
Right, but we're losing all our time. We're losing all of our connection with the people around us, and we have to use our spare time to do that.
So we exploit ourselves to ultimately for personal profit.
Yeah, not to sound like a hippie, but it sounds like the individual has an opportunity to grow as an individual in small groups, but once we get to this level of complexity, it's your cog in the machine.
Okay, yeah. So at this level of complexity, as you say, I'm like, the answer certainly can't be to go back to the way things were.
Right.
So you're not going to have smaller populations or try to isolate populations, but you can establish communities within a much larger growing population. Like, we're over 8 billion now, that you can establish communities based on ideas that we commonly hold to be true. And you know, far be it for me to say so, but the idea that you can master yourself, that's a unifying purpose. Because what is Shambhala, according to the Tibetan Buddhists? It's this place where every individual has realized themselves in their entirety. So maybe the real value of the idea of the hollow earth is the fact that if they can evolve into a much more advanced, beneficial, thoughtful, considerate, egalitarian society, then we can too. Right? That maybe that's not beyond us. But then there has to be something that unifies us regardless of political ideologies, religious ideologies, cultural creeds, you know, social groups, something that everybody can adopt. Right? Sanchin, you interpreted it as the struggle to unify mind, body, and spirit. Everybody could do that. Here, what's your struggle? You're here on this earth, and we don't know where we came from. We don't have those kind of large answers to those large questions. So then we're forced to either you adopt a purpose, and if you adopt an ideology that brings you in conflict with another ideology, all you've done is created conflict and the potential for more of it. Isn't that what's happening between Israel and Palestine? Right? So I'm going here. What could be more unifying and then non-denominational than the idea that you can master yourself, and you as an individual, you make it your purpose. You make it your individual purpose. I'm here to struggle to unify mind, body, and spirit. And then it's left open-ended because now you have to figure out how you're going to actually do that. But you have to address those three components: mind, body, and spirit. And you have to get them in balance. And the Tibetan Buddhists from Shambhala, they've achieved that already.
The interesting part of the story is the success. That's what makes me think it's a story. But the concept of just striving for that, it's almost unavoidable. If you don't want to deteriorate, you have to strive for that.
Okay, so then what if it's not? What if it's more than just a story? What if it's all of it? It is an actual physical location. It is a place, and it might it might be embedded in the crust of the earth, and it might be inhabited with evolved humans. I'm going. It's just a great idea, but it's an idea that we could implement and apply and realize within the reality that we currently inhabit, right? So it was a long-winded way to come to that conclusion, and it took us a while, but it made it gave it more weight by doing it in the way that we did. So hollow earth, whether it's real or not real, it doesn't matter, right? The idea that it represents, that you could have a gleaming city, a pure place of purity, a place where people strive to elevate themselves for the benefit of each other. I go, that's an endearing idea, and it's an idea whose time has come, right? Because all we're doing is the same shit that we did 100 years ago, and all it's going to produce is more significant body counts. And I'm like, fuck you. I'm kind of tired of it. I'm kind of tired of living in this fucking horrendous kind of way, where all we do is treat each other as things that will provide us gain, and you exploit each other to that end. I never wanted to be a participant in that. And I have a conscientious objection. As soon as I say that, I'm the madman. I'm not the fucking one killing people. Right? So I'm not the madman. Although I might come off like one.
Yeah, I was going to say, even with this concept of like a put together society with the right ideals, that's very easy to disrupt or just tilt the other way.
But if everybody, the unifying thing is every individual uses the same purpose, but then how they explore that purpose is individualized, that you have to figure out what it means to balance mind, body, and spirit, and how of how you're going to do that. I can tell you how I did it, but that's not important. The question becomes, how are you going to do it? Can I get a time check?
Yep. 1:27.
I think this is a perfect time to bring it to a close. What do you say?
Yeah, I think that was a strong point to end on.
Yeah, I you know what? I really did like this conversation. It was good. And again, I advocate for us presenting in a better way. That's it, right? And I try to live by that. I'm going to fail. We're all going to fail, but that's not the point. The point is to make the effort, right?
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, right on. So in closing, I think what I'd like to say is question everything, including yourself, especially yourself. Seek balance, seek knowledge, seek understanding. Become a renegade, individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful night.